morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's presentation, The Changing Landscape of Immigration and Refugee Policies in Canada. Before we begin our presentation today, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. My name is Colleen Drake. I am N4's Project Engagement Coordinator, and I will be hosting and moderating today's presentation with my colleague and co-host Yusuf Khalil, N4's Communications Specialist, who will be monitoring the Q&A box today. I am now pleased to introduce you to today's presenters. I am going to ask that you turn on your video as I introduce you. Maureen Silcoff is a partner at Silcoff, Shacter, and has been practicing immigration and refugee law since 1988, with a focus on public interest litigation. She is a former member of the Immigration and Refugee Board, past president of the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, and is an instructor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law. Maureen speaks in the media and at conferences on refugee immigration and access to justice issues. Laïla Demirdache has been working as a staff lawyer with Community Legal Services of Ottawa for over 20 years, where she has been providing legal representation advice in both English and French in the area of immigration and refugee law. Laïla has also been involved in a variety of advocacy initiatives, including litigation as co-counsel on behalf of immigrant and refugee serving organizations before the Federal Court, the Federal Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Ontario Court of Appeal, as well as at coroner's inquests into the death of detainees on immigration hold. She has also been a member of a number of committees for both the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers and the Canadian Council for Refugees. Welcome, Maureen and Laïla.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us to do this presentation.
Wonderful to have you both. And we just have a few housekeeping slides, and then I'll be handing it right over to you. So our presenters do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our N4 platform. We will share this with you as soon as it becomes available. Should there be any technical issues during the presentation, we will inform you with details for an alternate makeup session. Before we begin today's event, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to the platform features to help enhance your participation experience. Throughout today's session, we invite you to write your questions in the Q&A window. We know that sometimes many of you have the same questions, so please feel free to upvote a question, and that could be done in the Q&A. N4 is pleased to announce that select webinars are now accredited. Members of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada and the Canadian College of Health Leaders earn credits toward their maintenance of certification requirements by attending select N4 webinars. And with that said, let's jump right into today's presentation, and I will pass it over to our presenters to take it away. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to pull up our presentation, our PowerPoint.
So today we would like to speak about the changing landscape of immigration and refugee policies in Canada. And the format that we've decided to use is that of a series of questions. So we've mapped out individual questions on each slide, and we will be discussing the questions between ourselves, and there'll be time for participants' questions at the end. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because the landscape does change so quickly, and there's been quite a number of changes over the past years, but as well, we're in a bit of a holding pattern, waiting to see what the future could bring. So we hope that you find this interesting and informative. And we'll start off with the first question, which is, what changes in immigration policies have we been witnessing? And in order to answer that question, I'd like to highlight a few different areas where there have been immigration changes in the past while. As we know, immigration is an area where there could be changes happening at a fairly accelerated rate, and that's what we've seen over the past months and year or so, in fact. So one area, and I'm sure many of you have heard about some of these changes, is in terms of international students. And the government has recently announced caps on the numbers of students. And the government's goal has been to reduce the number of students in Canada by about 40%. The government has taken to the media to explain these cuts and to rationalize them in terms of pressures in Canada in terms of housing and settlement services, etc. So one of the changes is that for post-secondary education, there is a need for a provincial attestation letter in terms of one of the mandatory requirements to get the student visa. And the government has announced the national target for 2025 at being just over 400,000 students. So the cuts have been substantial on the international student front. We've seen opposition not just by students affected by this, but also by some of the universities and colleges that now have severely restricted entries by international students. So that's one area. Another area has to do with the labor market impact assessment, known as the LMIAs. And that's where an employer cannot find someone who has status in Canada already to take a job. There's a labor market shortage, and it allows the employer to advertise for a worker. And if no one who has certain status in Canada can fill the position, they are allowed to have that authorized, and an individual who could fill the job could take that opportunity. So there have been changes for the LMIAs. The government opened the criteria on that during COVID and after COVID, and that included certain low-wage jobs, and the government has now pulled back on that. So that's another significant increase, and we see some concern being expressed on the part of employers for that. A third category has to do with postgraduate work permits. And we now see that only certain fields are eligible for postgraduate work permits, and the duration of the work permits depend on, in part, on the type of degree you have and the length of your program. So that's been pulled back as well. A couple of other areas that I want to mention: work permits for spouses of students or spouses of workers. Those now are subject to further restrictions depending on the fields of work or study. Parental sponsorships, that's significant because they've been on hold for quite a number of years, and so the government is processing applications that have been filed a while ago, but the door is closed to new applications. And then finally, something that covers many of these areas, the levels. So the government announces levels or targets of immigration to Canada. And this year, for the first time, the government included temporary residents with their categories of permanent residents. So the government has now reduced the number of permanent residents to under 400,000, a significant cut from the year before. And the permanent residents are divided into categories, and economic immigrants have the largest number of anticipated targets, and then family class, and then smaller than that, refugees. And we see for the first time, temporary residence is included in the levels. So the shift downward and the inclusion of temporary residents is a big change in terms of the levels. So I think those are some of the main immigration changes. And Laïla, perhaps you have a couple of other things to mention on that.
So everybody may have heard that the federal government has announced cuts to the federal civil service, and significant cuts have actually been announced for IRCC. So Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada will have over 3,300 positions cut, which will have huge impacts on a number of ways that it works. Apart from the cuts to the federal civil servants, they've also in December announced cuts to settlement agencies. So there's a number of agencies across Canada that assist newcomers and refugees in settling in Canada. And the cuts have been quite significant. According to reports, what's been happening is that organizations that have programs that have been receiving funding for years and years and years from IRC, so they're like 3-year contracts, 5-year contracts that get renewed, have been told, we're told in December that they would not be renewed. And other agencies are facing cuts up to 70% cuts from IRCC of their funding. So those were announced in December, and we're starting to see what's happening now. A number of settlement agencies are having to lay off people. But the cuts are not only affecting settlement agencies, they're also affecting integration programs. So ESL courses, link programs, a number of training programs that were not being done by the settlement agencies themselves are also being affected by these cuts. And we won't know the full impact of those cuts for a while, but they're already being felt. So we're going to move on to the next question, which was, what are some of the current challenges for facing individuals in Canada applying for temporary and/or permanent residence? So as Maureen has said, a number of programs have been cut in terms of temporary residence. So people can no longer apply for programs they would have qualified for or were in the process of applying for in terms of the temporary residence. And those are the work permits, the study permits, and the visitor's visas. People are no longer, access to permanent residence is also being affected. So if you may have been eligible, there were a number of programs from within Canada that you could apply for to get from being a temporary resident, either a student or a worker, and then applying for permanent residence. They were called Pathways to PR programs, and the eligibility programs for those have changed, which means that some people who came and would have qualified no longer qualify. The impact between the changes in the levels and the cuts to the staff at IRCC are going to result in longer wait times and increasing insecurity for people who may be here in Canada, not knowing what their future holds. It's also, the longer wait times will have a huge impact on family separation. And I took out a statistics to according to IRCC's website. So some people can obtain children and dependents overseas of people who've been found to be convention refugees can apply for permanent resident as a dependent of the person who was found to be convention refugees. The processing times right now for those applications, according to IRCC's website that I checked today, is 51 months, which is a staggering length to wait for your child or your spouse to join you in Canada. Because less people are eligible. So one of the changes that we've seen is that workers and students were eligible, the spouses of worker and students were eligible for work permits, and those have been cut, which means there's now a bigger financial burden on the family because the spouse is no longer able to work while the person is, for example, studying. The lack of information on, and because of all the changes and the lack of information and the insecurity that's happening, and at the same time, a narrative, a discourse that we hear that is a growing anti-immigration and refugee discourse, there's more of an impact on people's mental health. We have more people that are staying under the radar for fear of being removed from Canada. And I think this is particularly problematic. I do a lot of work with victims of family violence. And you have people who are going to be staying in very vulnerable situations for fear of being removed, should they come forward. Maureen?
And aside from, as though this wasn't enough to contend with, there's one other issue I think that's at the forefront, and particularly with respect to temporary residents, which is IRCC's use of artificial intelligence. That's something that the legal community has been tracking for a number of years. People know at this point that there are artificial intelligence systems used in terms of processing temporary residence applications, but the exact details are quite opaque. So sometimes by the time lawyers can get access to the actual details of the AI being used, that is now out of date and a new system is in place. There have been several cases in the federal court challenging the use of artificial intelligence and different processing systems using this kind of data technology. Very often the cases end up settling in advance of the court decisions. So it's something that still needs to be dealt with by the court on a broader level in terms of determining whether these AI systems create any kind of unfairness in the processing of cases. And one last point to flag on this issue, concern has been expressed that often AI builds on past information. And so there's concern about inherent racial bias built into AI systems in terms of predictions for the future. So whether somebody will be granted a visa, the artificial intelligence system could track prior refusals, but if there was any racial bias built into that, that will just be prolonged and exacerbated. So that's one particular point to watch for there. Okay, so the third question is, what changes in refugee policies have we been witnessing? We've been speaking more about immigration, and what about refugee issues? So one important change is to the Safe Third Country Agreement, the STCA. That's been in place and in effect for a number of years, since 2004. But in 2023, an additional protocol was signed by both countries. So the way that it's affected people is, I'm sure many people have heard about the closure of Roxham Road. People who were in the US who were subject to the STCA bar were able to still walk across the border at Roxham Road and be processed in the refugee system. The additional protocol from 2023 stopped that and said, this agreement applies from coast to coast, all along the border, even between ports of entry. There is a small exception. If someone crosses the border undetected, they could remain in Canada undetected for 14 days and then come forward. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But that's a major change that has meant people simply cannot come to Canada to seek protection from the United States. Second change came into effect in 2019, and it's a provision that barred other categories of people from accessing refugee protection at the Immigration and Refugee Board. So even though you can enter Canada from the United States, for example, then you were not given a full hearing before the Immigration and Refugee Board. You were given an inferior process before a pre-removal risk assessment officer who works for the immigration department. So not only do you have fewer protections, but for people who are from countries where Canada does not deport people, they're called moratorium countries, they're not even given the pre-removal risk assessment. And so those category of people are basically kept in limbo for years and years. And the only way out of that limbo is to put forward a humanitarian application. So there's serious effects of that provision. And a couple of other things worth mentioning. The government has increased its use of cessation. Cessation usually comes into play if someone goes back to their country of origin and Canada Border Services Agency realizes that and tries to bring them to a hearing before the Immigration and Refugee Board to remove their refugee status. We've seen an increase with that. And often there's good reasons why people have returned, and it's for a temporary nature. And we've seen decisions that have very harsh impacts on people. And then there's also the issue of vacation, so that the government could vacate your refugee status if it was obtained through misrepresentation. And we're seeing a very targeted focus by the government on one population in particular, which is people who are refugees from Somalia, and the government alleges that they're actually a different person, a person with Kenyan citizenship. And so people in that situation are brought to vacation hearings and often have a difficult time trying to defend themselves. So that's one change. And then I think those are the things that I wanted to cover. So I'll stop at that. And Laïla, you, I think, have something that you wanted to mention.
So one of the things we've seen a lot is a change in the rhetoric also behind these policies, or which are what is moving or pushing the government to make these changes. So because of the fears of flooding of refugees and immigrants, because of the economic situation, you have now a rhetoric around refugees where we're talking about, so a government that welcomed refugees initially is now talking about bogus claims and trying to weed out bogus refugees. And there's a lot of misinformation that is coming along because there's been so many changes in these policies that people are not sure what the procedures are anymore, how they're supposed to apply for refugee protection. And one of the things that has come out of this is that if you've come through the US and you can no longer make your claim initially at the border, people are still coming in, but they have to stay, they're not allowed to make a claim from within Canada for 14 days. So you have now refugee claimants staying underground for 14 days before they can even approach anybody to make a claim for refugee protection. So now I'm going to move on to the next slide. So what are the challenges given these changes in refugee protection? So one of the biggest challenges is accessing refugee protection. So now you have people that have to wait for, as I mentioned, 14 days. They're not able to access anything. So not refugee protection, any services, any healthcare, nothing at all. There's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation of what the process is. And the government, with the advent of COVID, has switched to portals. So you have online portals that are initiated at the border when you're crossing at the airport or at the border, if you're allowed to make a claim for refugee protection in Canada, or if you're making it from within Canada, you're dealing with these portals. These portals are in English and French only, and they're very complicated. They're not user-friendly, even for practicing lawyers, let alone people who are unrepresented and don't speak the languages. And depending on the information that you put in those portals or you don't put in those portals, it can affect your credibility before the Immigration and Refugee Board. There are now massive backlogs and wait times for your hearing in Canada. So according to the IRB, the Immigration and Refugee Board's website, as of October 31st, the inventory of pending refugee claims was 85,300 cases still waiting for a hearing. That's a massive amount. On top of that, there's 7,100 cases of refugee claims who've been refused and who are waiting for their appeal to be processed. According to the website, the wait times for refugee hearings is approximately 24 months. And in order to, because the backlog has been an issue for a while, the federal government had put in temporary extra funding to address these backlogs. And with the cuts to immigration, that Immigration and Refugees IRCC is doing, the IRB does not know if they will get continued funding to address those backlogs. Another thing that we've seen in terms of challenges are that people who have been refused refugee protection, so they are contacted by the Canada Border Services Agency to proceed with their removal. When they applied for refugee protection, they were eligible for a work permit, and that work permit was renewed. But the minute they get contacted by the Canada Border Services Agency now, they're canceling those work permits, even if removal will not happen for several weeks or even a month, which means that people can no longer work while they're waiting to be removed from Canada. And it's always been on the books, but it's a practice that's actually happening. Whereas before, the CBSA officers would say, well, at least you're working until it's time to remove you. But now if people don't have access to that work and they're no longer eligible for social assistance because they're going to be removed from, they're removal ready, it's going to have a huge impact. Maureen?
So I think one thing I just wanted to add on to this, and Laïla, you touched on this a little bit, has to do with the Immigration and Refugee Board's processing of the refugee claims and the fact that it's very slow. There's a huge backlog, and what could be done? So the tribunal had put in place one measure called file review process where people could possibly be accepted as refugees without going to a hearing. Their counsel would be asked to submit documents to support their claim, and they would see whether a board member could determine they should be accepted as a refugee without the hearing. The problem with that is it's still a very slow process. It doesn't expedite anything, and not a lot of claims are captured under that. So it's not really making a significant dent in the numbers. And so it kind of requires some creative thinking about what could be done. And one measure could be, if the government starts thinking about a refugee backlog program that could maybe clear refugees without them having going through the refugee determination process. It would be an immigration-led program. They wouldn't necessarily be conferred with refugee status, but it would alleviate some of the harsh realities of the lengthy waiting time. And so that's one measure that might be considered. Okay, so we can move on now to question 5, which is how do these changes in immigration and refugee policies impact access to healthcare? So as I'm sure we've all seen, that healthcare is tied to immigration status, right? So people who don't have status have a difficult time accessing healthcare and don't have a federal document that gives them access to healthcare. People with precarious status often have a hard time as well because it's unclear what healthcare status they have, and sometimes they have none. This is coupled with the fact that people are often scared to access healthcare if they have precarious status, but particularly if they lack any kind of status. We're also witnessing a lack of regularization programs. So people might have been following the immigration minister saying for quite a while now that the government is considering a regularization program. And then the government said, well, there won't be a broad regularization program. It might be a narrow program tied to certain labor market needs, sector specific, but that hasn't been announced either. And so to the extent that people in the refugee system aren't, don't have the ability to access any kind of regularization program, or people who are undocumented don't have the ability to access it, their health care is also affected. Another category of people is Laïla was talking about the people who come between ports of entry undetected and have to wait 14 days to access the refugee system. During that 14-day period, they could have very serious health issues that require attention, but they do not access healthcare out of fear that they could get reported to the government and not be able to access the refugee determination system, which requires being undetected for 14 days. And this is a very serious problem, which might increase with the new policies in the US, which we'll talk about shortly, because we've seen very vulnerable people crossing the border. And unfortunately, this includes people who've been sexually abused by human traffickers, who are in dire need of immediate health care and don't necessarily have access to it. So Laïla, I'll turn it over to you for a couple of other points.
But one of the other things that we've seen is that the interim federal health program is a very complicated program, and a lot of providers don't like dealing with the IFHP. So we have clients who are getting refused services or access to healthcare because that program is not being, the provider doesn't want to deal with it. The IRCC is always changing the way they issue either. So it used to be that you would get a separate interim federal health document, a brown paper. Now you don't get that anymore, or it was always valid even if it expired. Then you could renew it. Then they didn't need you to renew it again. So they're always changing, and now it's appearing on the refugee claimant document. So it's the piece of paper, the brown paper that says you're a refugee claimant. And I just had a client contact me today to tell me that because she came as a refugee claimant, so she made a claim for refugee protection. She was given the refugee claimant document, but then when they realized 2 years later that she hadn't actually, that she had applied for refugee protection in the US, she was no longer eligible for a refugee hearing in front of the Immigration and Refugee Board, but rather to have a pre-removal risk assessment officer assess her risks. So they actually gave her a new brown paper. And that brown paper still says that she's eligible for interim federal health care, but she just got refused yesterday because the healthcare provider is like, no, I don't, this is not the same one. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of problems with the process that's very heavy and difficult. And I think that the long wait times, the increased rhetoric around anti-immigration and refugee rhetoric and is really going to have a huge impact on people's mental and physical health, which will cause a burden or increase burdens on our health care system. I've also heard, it's anecdotal, that that there are some healthcare institutions that will reach out to Canada Border Services Agency when someone shows up without a proper status document. So the next question is, how is the legal community responding to these changes in immigration and refugee policies? And so we're trying to respond in a number of ways. One of the main ways that we have been responding is through strategic litigation. So as Maureen mentioned, there were challenges that were launched to the Safe Third Country Agreement, and we're going to be talking about that next to explain more in detail what's been happening. There's also been cases challenging the issuance of the pre-removal, so the removal of the eligibility to make a claim for refugee protection to unaccompanied minors. So unaccompanied minors who had made a claim in the US and had subsequently made a claim in Canada were found ineligible to make that claim because they had made a claim in the US, and we were successful in challenging the fact that they actually didn't have capacity to understand the process and what making a claim in the US was, because their intention was always to come to Canada where they had family. There's been challenges to the way the PRA is served on people with mental health issues, because the PRA has very strict deadlines, and if you do not meet those deadlines, then you can face immediate removal from Canada. And so there's been challenges at issuing those to people who do not have the capacity to understand the process and to meet those deadlines. There's been strategic litigation around the cessation cases. As Maureen mentioned, those are the cases where they're trying to cease refugee protection, and strategic litigation challenging the vacation of refugee protection. Another way that the legal community has been trying to address these challenges is through lobbying. There's been a lot of organizing and lobbying on Parliament Hill to different ministers, sometimes both at the federal and the provincial level, to try and address some of the immigration and refugee challenges that we are facing. And I will pass it to you, Maureen.
Okay, and I guess I just want to add, the fact that some of the changes, especially those that arose from the previous government, the Conservative government changes, basically led to the creation of the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, CARL, that I had led for a number of years. And, nationally, immigration and refugee lawyers saw an imperative to come together and try and see what could be challenged in the court about some of these new measures. And so that was a benefit in terms of being able to have a more forceful legal kind of front in court. CARL and other organizations partnered together, including non-legal organizations. So, yeah, for example, CARL has partnered with Amnesty International, with CCR, with other groups in terms of putting together legal challenges, advocacy, etc. And it's also in terms of advocacy, made organizations like CARL understand the importance of trying to see what responses could be obtained without necessarily going to court. So we see, for example, you might have recalled the Guardian Angels program that focused on pandemic healthcare workers. A large number of people had crossed through Roxham Road and were living in Quebec and were working in long-term care homes and were risking their own health to care for others. And there was a program put in place, a pathway for those individuals. And that was something that didn't require litigation. And as well, CARL was involved in legal aid advocacy, because if people recall, the Ontario government in 2019 decided to cut all funding for immigration and refugee matters through the legal aid program. and Carl was able to advocate with Ottawa for to fill the gap, and that included not just Ontario, but a number of provinces that had a shortfall in terms of legal aid funding for refugees. So that was another measure that was used that didn't necessarily involve litigation. Okay, so we'll move on to the seventh question, which is what is the legal STCA challenge? What happened in the last legal challenge? Where does the law stand? And are there further legal challenges? So I'll try and not take too much time on this because it's something that's very interesting. I've been spending a lot of time on this, and we could probably even just have a whole session on this, and I'm mindful of the time and we want to leave some time for question. But essentially, the Safe Third Country Agreement, or the STCA, bars many people from entering Canada if they arrive from the US into Canada at the land border. There are exceptions built into this agreement. So the one that people probably most likely have heard about is if you have an anchor relative in Canada. That's most often used. The Canadian Council for Refugees, Amnesty International, the Canadian Council of Churches, and 3 individuals launched litigation to try and strike this down. The Supreme Court of Canada issued a decision in 2023 saying there are charter concerns, but that there's discretion on the part of the border officers to use what they called safety valves, so that even if someone is barred from entering, if they present a compelling case, they could be allowed to enter based on humanitarian factors. They could have their removal deferred. They can ask for a temporary permit and things like that. So it's a little bit of a fiction because the border doesn't actually operate in that way. There are currently 3 cases before the courts. So one is in that same decision, the Supreme Court said the lower court didn't look at equality rights and discrimination faced in particular by people with gender-based claims. So that has to go back for a new challenge at the federal court. Number 2, there was a case launched to challenge this notion of safety valves being used at the border. And number 3, there's a new case launched to deal with the government's requirement to ensure that designation still meets the criteria in the law. So in other words, that the US is complying with its human rights obligations. And I'm actually counsel in that litigation. So all of them will take some time to wind their way through the court. So there's no easy or quick solution. And I'll stop there, and Laïla, I'll let you comment.
So one of the things that's been happening a lot is a lot of collaboration, and that collaboration isn't only between legal organizations in Canada. There's also collaboration that's been across the border between organizations in Canada and in the US that are looking to protect refugees and refugee claimants. Recently, there's now a new Canada-US border clinic that operates, and they provide free legal advice and assistance to people that are trying to figure out how they can safely seek protection in Canada. And that Canada-US border clinic is a member of the Canada-US border network, and that's an informal network of organizations and individuals both in Canada and in the US that are working collaboratively to support and ensure protection of refugee claimants on both sides of the border. So that's the only thing that I was going to add given our time. I'm going to go on to our next question. So what immigration refugee issues, challenges are we seeing or should we look out for since the new administration has taken office in the US? So when the Trump administration was last in power in 2017, we saw a movement of refugees living in the US that came to Canada to seek protection in Canada. According to the numbers, the claims went from just under 24,000 claims for refugee protection made in Canada in 2016 to over 55,000 claims made in 2018. So we're going to see more of those, or we can expect to see more numbers coming through. We're going to see more people who are subjected to trafficking and are going to be more vulnerable to organized criminality. The border is definitely already being tightened. So in response to the threats and the of tariffs, the Canadian government in December 2017, on December 17th, 2024, they released a $1.3 billion border plan to bolster border security and strengthen the immigration system. And it has a bunch of measures that have been announced, but one of the things that is going to be have a huge impact on people looking to immigrate or seek Canada's protection is that they've increased the authority for CBSA and IRCC staff to cancel, change, or suspend immigration documents. So like I talked about suspending the work permits, and to cancel, suspend, and stop accepting new applications. And as we've mentioned before in this earlier today, they've canceled a number of programs. They've suspended a number of programs. So for example, I forgot to mention that the private sponsorship of refugees, which was a highly successful program, and looked at sponsoring private groups of 5 could sponsor people to come to Canada, and we saw a lot of that with the Syrian crisis. That has been suspended until 2026. They're not taking in any new applications, and they've also provided increased funding to CBSA. So this border plan provides increased funding to CBSA to increase the rate in which they remove inadmissible people. And they said that the focus is on people who are a danger to the Canadian public. But from my work, what I've seen is that it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the women and children, the families, the law-abiding people who are being removed at an increased rate. There's going to be more immigration detention, we believe, that's going to come along with the increased border tightening and less access to refugee protection for people seeking Canada's protection. Maureen?
And I think the only thing I should add to this is, I think kind of lessons learned, right? So I think no matter who is in government, we have to be prepared for cuts to the system, changes to the system, and of course, flowing from any changes to immigration and refugee legal matters are healthcare consequences. So something to be aware of. Laïla, I'm just wondering, I know in terms of our time, and I know we're finishing up at 2, and I see a bunch of questions. Maybe we should just deal with one more of our questions and leave time for the participants' questions.
Yeah, I think we should deal with question 10.
Okay, perfect. So let's do that.
So, in 2012, the former Conservative government made a significant changes to refugee laws and policies. And one of the ones that they did that had a huge impact on healthcare was they cut the funding for interim federal health. They suspended the program for refugee claimants. So that had a huge impact and made great waves. And what happened at that time, for anybody who wasn't around, was that the doctors, the healthcare professionals, took to the streets and they did lots of actions around there. And what happened is that the doctors and lawyers, the healthcare professionals and the lawyers got together and they worked collaboratively to try and challenge it. So you had lobbying done by healthcare professionals and by lawyers, and you also had strategic litigation that was based on challenges made by the legal community, but based on evidence that was provided to us by the healthcare community. And I'm going to let Maureen continue with the rest of those questions.
Right. So so essentially the court said that the changes to the refugee healthcare, which basically eliminated healthcare or drastically cut healthcare were unconstitutional. They violated equality rights in Section 15 of the Charter and said the government had to change the policy. So the government did change the policy, but not as broadly as the legal team thought the court required. So we went back to court to say that the government had not complied with the court order, and the court didn't agree that the policy changes that were reinstated were too narrow. In the meantime, the government actually also appealed the decision, but before the appeal was heard, there was an election in 2015, and the Liberal government came to power and decided to withdraw the appeal. So that's a bit of a high-level history to the Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care litigation. In that situation, the healthcare practitioners, the lawyers came together to litigate the matter, and it was indeed successful. When the Liberal governments took office, they actually reinstated healthcare fully to the way it was and had been since 1957. So that was a success story. And I'm just noticing the time. Perhaps we should stop and allow a bit of time for questions. Maybe we can fit some of our other comments into the responses.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laïla and Maureen. And I am seeing lots of questions come in, many of which you have already addressed in your presentation, which is fantastic, but we do want to dive into those. A big thank you so much for that presentation. And any questions, just so the audience knows that we do not get to today, we will connect with our presenters and make sure that those do not go not answered. So we'll dive into these questions, and those that we do not get a chance to address, we will get to at a later date. So we'll start with, do we have different legal protection in Canada for refugee claimants that provide additional protections that the US system to prevent the mass deportations we're seeing there? So you can see these questions as well, Laïla and Maureen, but I will repeat that. So do we have different legal protection in Canada for refugee claimants that provide additional protections that the US system does not provide?
So I don't mind starting with that. So I think what we're witnessing now is a series of overreaching executive orders, right, by President Trump that have sweeping implications. And in Canada, the law doesn't work that way. We don't have these broad executive orders where the Prime Minister simply signs off on a document and then people's lives are completely turned upside down. So that's one thing to mention. There are, for example, for removal of people, there's a process that people have to go to. There's a legislative requirement that the government has to follow. Now, that's not to say that a system that's could be seen as fairly slow in terms of removals can't be sped up. It doesn't mean that there can't be more CBSA officers put in place. It doesn't mean that removals can't be faster. We don't know what measures might be put in place by a new government that we're likely to see happen in Canada within this year. But I think it's something to be alert to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add is, like I've mentioned, there's more funding that's going to go to stop people from coming in and to remove people quicker. One of the things is that when you're removing somebody to a country, the country has to accept them. So first of all, they need travel documents. People might have expired travel documents. It could take a while to obtain, but the country has to accept them. And one of the ways that, if the CBSA thinks that you're not going to show up for your removal, they can detain you. So on the one hand, there may be increased detention, immigration detention, but on the other hand, I don't know if you know, there's been a campaign by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International to stop the detention of immigrants and refugees in provincial facilities, and those have been somewhat successful, though. And all of the provinces basically said they would stop, though they've been extending that because other measures are not in place to where they're going to be holding them. So I do think that there are going to be changes, but I like Maureen said, it's not going to be, we have a lot more protections in Canada for people built into the system.
Mhm. Fantastic. Thank you for that. We're hearing more international students are claiming refugee status, thinking it allows them, due to backlogs, to stay at work in Canada. Are you seeing the trend and how the policies are or will impact them?
So, you know, it is a debate. What I'm seeing in my office are students who thought that they would be able to stay here in Canada, finish their program, and then have a pathway to permanent residence, are applying for are applying for refugee protection because they have issues in their home country that they didn't have to worry about. They weren't going to be facing that because they had a pathway to permanent residence. So you're seeing people whose sexual orientation would put them at risk of persecution in their home country who never thought of making a claim for refugee protection or never thought they needed to make a claim for refugee protection because they had a pathway as a student towards permanent residence, and they preferred taking that pathway than the refugee claim. So I don't think that there's a, you know, that for me has to do a lot with the rhetoric around bogus, international students are being blamed for the housing crisis, and now they're also being blamed for adding a backlog to the immigration refugee. It doesn't mean that people aren't trying to cheat the system, but it doesn't mean that I think we have to go back and look at each case to find out why a person is actually making a claim for refugee protection.
Yeah, and just to add to that, something else to think about. So, Canada has restrictions on entry for people seeking refugee protection. We've talked about the STCA with the Canada-US land border. There's also visa restrictions, right? So that people can't necessarily just fly into Canada. What we have always seen, though, are agents or smugglers charging people vast amounts of money to arrange for their travel, sometimes with a false passport, etc. And then people come and make refugee claims. It says nothing about the merits of the refugee claims, right? How you enter says nothing about the merits of the refugee claims. So it could also be that because Canada was open to more international student permits, that smugglers just took advantage of that route and also decided, well, instead of getting a false passport, you can get a student visa. It doesn't mean, again, that people don't have merit to the refugee claim. So something to think about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laïla and Maureen. And I wish we had more time today to get to the many questions that our audience has shared. It looks like we may have to set up another webinar with you both and fit it into your calendars. I can't say thank you enough for your presentation today. And obviously, I'll say many thanks to our audience for joining us again. And I hope you'll join us for upcoming events. We've listed a couple of our presentations that are coming up February 12th and March 19th. If at your colleagues or you missed any part of the presentation today and you'd like to watch the recording, you can find that on N4's platform and it'll be available in the next week. We also have curated resources, so be sure to check those out. Following today's presentation, there will be a survey that will pop up on your screen. These surveys really help us plan for these webinars, look at topics that are of interest to our audience, so please take the time to do that. We greatly appreciate it. We have the N4 mobile app, so if you haven't already, please check this out. And I will hand it back to Laïla and Maureen and give them the opportunity for any last words you'd like to share with the audience. So thank you so much.
I just wanted to, thank everybody for attending, and say that we're more than open to continue working collaboratively with healthcare professionals to deal with upcoming challenges.
Yeah, and I'd just like to reiterate that point because I think we do have to work together. We, potentially see very harsh measures down the road. And I think if we could brainstorm together, see what advocacy, including inside the court and outside the court, we can work collaboratively on that will best serve the refugees and immigrants who we're trying to support. So thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing our attendees at future webinars. And a big thank you to Laïla and Maureen for their presentation today. And those questions will be wrapped up and we'll get some answers for you. So we'll see you at our next webinar. Thank you so much.